Hey everyone, Destiny Course Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd. I hope you're doing well. And I don't know if you guys have seen it. I certainly have, through a bunch of emails and people reaching out to me, asking my thoughts on the current state of music criticism today, because again, it is seemingly a topic that a lot of writers are interested in right now. And I was even interviewed for a piece that just landed in The New Yorker titled "Everything Nice: How Music Criticism Lost Its Edge."
Music critics used to be mean, and then they got nice. Pitchfork, they famously once gave a 0.0 to an Australian band called Jet, and instead of writing a review, they had a little video of a chimpanzee peeing into its own mouth.
The writer is Kelefa Sanneh, who made a lot of great observations in the piece and has also written a book, Major Labels: A History of Popular Music in 7 Genres. And I liked the piece so much, I wanted to have him on to essentially discuss some of the deeper points he wrote about. I hope you guys enjoy the conversation and get a lot out of it. Also, check out his stuff down below in the D-Box. Okay, let's get into it. So the piece, as I've already said, loved it, really impressed with it. I like the ways in which you kind of like broke down these various aspects and things that have kind of like massively impacted the current state of music criticism. And I was hoping to kind of like go over each of them or most of them with you. Maybe starting with like kind of the idea that music critics now, of what professional ones there are left, it sort of seems like today, in comparison with previous eras of music criticism, they're just like, I don't know, more accessible than they've ever been. And we're sort of seeing more critics out there today who are maybe less willing to or less able to kind of take the intense heat of harassment and sometimes doxing and hatred that kind of comes their way due to certain fandoms not liking whatever negative takes or reviews that are coming out of their favorite artist's new album.
Well, yeah, I mean, so no one wants to hear critics complain, right? No one wants to hear anyone complain on behalf of critics. And I think if you talk to a lot of artists, they'd be like, well, yeah, welcome to our reality, right? If you're a singer and you say something and you pop off, you can get intense backlash. So there is a sense in which everyone, not just critics, but also the people they write about, are careful, maybe are cautious, have a one eye towards what's happening on social media and what might happen if they spark a conversation on social media. I think if we zoom out and we rewind, if you go back to the dawn of rock criticism in the 1960s, it's kind of a smaller community and the feedback mechanism doesn't work quite the same way, right? Like you write your anger review, they print it in the Village Voice or the Rolling Stone. Maybe the artist sees it and says something about it. Maybe someone writes a letter to the publication, but there wasn't the same kind of feedback. There wasn't the sense that we're all in the same place. I had a moment once at Coachella where Mos Def came up to me and I was like, oh, Mos Def. I'd met him, I'd interviewed him for something. And he comes up to me and he says, I'm sorry you didn't like the album, man. And I was like, right. Yeah, I forgot I had given him a negative review recently. And I was like, how's this going to go? And then he smiles and he's like, well, I liked it. And it was a really gracious response from him to that review. But I think for a lot of critics, there is this sense that there are things that you write that would be a little awkward to say to someone's face, right? And sometimes, I don't know if you've had this experience, but sometimes, a critic and an artist meet and the artist is like, all that stuff you were talking when you were writing the review, like, why don't you say it to my face? Like, or you were acting nice to me at this thing and then you wrote this mean thing about me, right? And the response to that is like, well, that would be rude. Like, it would be weird to go up to someone and be like, just so you know, I don't like your album. And I think that, so we have these social norms that govern how we talk, and especially how we talk when we're being critical. One thing that changed with social media is it put us all in the room together, right? It blurs the distinction between talking about someone, the way me and you might talk about some record, and talking to someone, right? You put that view out there into the world, whether or not it's on social media, the artist can hear it. The artist is part of that conversation. And so I think one thing that everyone's navigating is that sometimes in social media, it can feel like everyone's shouting at each other. And so things can go viral. There's this context collapse where you don't know who's going to hear something. It could be some random DJ in Eastern Europe might say something about K-pop, and the next day it could be an international story. So I think that has had a somewhat inhibiting influence on the way people talk about music, especially when they have something not so positive to say.
Yeah, I mean, and as you say, like not just in the case of critics, but artists too. You know, I mean, I don't know what reflections you might have on this observation, but you know, I'm at least, I think, old enough to remember like a time period where, I don't know, it seemed like we had, generally speaking, more mainstream artists who, when it came to interviews, conversations, their own personal opinions when it comes to their music, other people's music, were maybe more regularly kind of firing from the hip. And it seems like these days, one of the only people we have on the mainstream who's like willing to do that is like Matty Healy, or, you know, somebody who is clearly not operating with like all of his marbles like a Kanye West or something like that. And
yeah, it's like you become known as a troll if you do that, right? Like a lot of
right.
people know about Matty Healy's interviews who don't even necessarily know that much about the 1975. And so then a lot of other artists are like, well, I don't want to be thought of as someone who's always talking shit about other artists. And I've actually had situations where if I'm working on a profile about someone and they mention some other artist in what could be a sort of like a negative or a semi-critical way, I'll have a moment where I'm like, I don't know if I want to put that in the story because that's going to eat the whole story, right? That's going to be the thing that everyone remembers. And also sometimes it feels like there's something unfair about it, right? Like singers or rappers or members of bands, they're listeners just like me and you are. They have views about all sorts of music, but also these are their peers. And so,
yeah.
yes,
I mean,
it can be awkward.
just to break it up. I mean, like privately speaking, some of the strongest opinions I've heard about music generally come from artists I've spoken to. But you know, but just like off the record, I mean, some of your favorite artists are very opinionated about the music they do and don't like.
And that was one of the things that led me to write this piece, was just thinking about how when you talk to a regular music listener, which after all is what me and you are, right? We're just people who love to listen to music. People have super strong opinions, right? They'll say, "No, I hate this album." They'll say, "I hate this artist." They'll say, "I hate this whole genre," right? And yet the people who write about music for a living often tend to express much milder opinions. And I thought that was interesting and kind of funny because back in the day it was the opposite, right? Back in the day you go back to the early 1970s, and there is this idea that most people are kind of have mild opinions about music, and then music critics are the maniacs or the assholes who really hate stuff and have these strong views. And so it was interesting to me that that had kind of flipped over the decades.
You know, what else do you think about what I feel like currently is the other side of this internet discourse review coin? Because with the rise of what you have observed here is like, you know, nicer criticism for a myriad of different reasons that we'll get into. You know, we're just kind of scratching the surface of one. But on the other side of this coin, I feel like with people like you and I, or people who are doing music criticism professionally, kind of softening their takes and softening the things that they say, maybe out of fear of getting some backlash on one level. You have also kind of like this new generation of very opinionated listeners who are constantly dropping like viral, angry, vitriolic takes that are sometimes lazy and very pithy and low effort on a bunch of different songs, on a bunch of different albums, but they're doing so anonymously, you know, and it sort of seems like it's kind of created this really weird gap where on one side you have the critics and opinionators who you know and have some kind of brand that they're building off of the things that they say on a regular basis. And then you have all of these people who are like completely unknown and they're saying some of the worst, most awful, most sometimes uninformed and off base stuff that you've ever read or heard.
I think you see this divergence throughout the media, right? Where as you get more of a free for all, where more people have a voice, where it's easier for people to go viral in a kind of social media world, there is, I think, an increasing an expectation sometimes that people who do this professionally be on their best behavior, right? So that the takes, because anything you say that's not that can also go viral. So sometimes you do see that not just in music, but in politics and all sorts of walks of life, where you have incredibly like nuclear grade takes floating around the world online. And then the people who do it for a living are really trying and sometimes failing to be on their best behavior. I think it's also, I mean, I think it also has something to do with the structure of the media industry, right? And this strange job that I was, I've been lucky to have at the New York Times in the 2000s. I was a sort of full-time music critic. And even then, I realized that I was really lucky to have this cool, weird job that not that many people had. And as that job went away, I think music reviewing moved often to more of a freelance model, right? The old model was you're Robert Christgau, you're the dean of American rock criticism, and like every record that comes out is going to go across your desk and you're going to say what you think about it. And if there's some genre you don't like so much, well, those records are going to get lower grades, right? He was grading things, still is grading things with
Right.
letter grades. I think the newer model is more of a freelance model often, where editors are assigning reviews to different writers. And I think, you can understand that you're likely to assign a review of an album to someone who likes that kind of thing, right? Someone who likes that genre, maybe someone who likes that artist, right? The Bad Bunny review, he's 6 albums and a compilation and a joint album into his career. So when the ninth full-length release comes out, you're probably assigning it to someone who likes the previous 8. So I think that has created a certain built-in bias that makes sense, in a lot of ways, but it ends up meaning that you're often reading reviews from people who sort of are already broadly sympathetic to what's happening.
Yeah, and I feel like with the freelance model, it's creating a pool of writers and critics that like I don't know. It kind of makes me without having thought of this when I was starting, it makes me kind of like miss a time when you knew you were reading the opinions of somebody who had like a broad sense of everything that was coming out and sort of like saw whatever they were reviewing and whatever they were talking about as kind of like in a greater context of numerous different things that are like going on in the music industry currently. And if, the only thing that's kind of fueling your drive to cover something is like, a really small freelance fee and just the fact that you just really love and have a lot of passion for this artist, like you may miss the forest for the trees and like, just really end up glowing over an album that maybe in the grander scheme of things is like not really that special or even derivative on some level.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's upsides and downsides to this, right? I think the modern information economy has generally made it easier to be a specialist and harder to be a generalist. Like if you think about the newspaper model, there was this idea that you spend years as a reporter, as a beat reporter, and then you would sort of rise through the ranks and sort of earn the right to become a columnist once you had spent all those years reporting. And obviously, the economic model kind of shifted that, where you have a more opinion first model. So a lot of people are making their name, young reporters, by giving their opinions. And honestly, there is less of a training ground, right? If you want to become a music generalist for your career, it's not like there's tons of like music reporting jobs that you can work at for 10 or 15 years. It's not like you have an expectation that there's enough stability in the industry that you're going to build this broad base of knowledge. You just have to kind of learn stuff and jump in where you can. I will say the other part of it is that when I became a pop music critic in the New York Times in 2002, it's not like there was a literal test. It's not like I had some credential to show them that I knew what I was talking about. In fact, quite the opposite. I remember before I got hired, I went to see Bjork at Radio City Music Hall with John Pareles, who was then the chief pop music critic of the New York Times. Brilliant guy. And we're listening to the concert. This might have been like late 2001, I think. And I look over at him, and the dude has drawn 5 lines in his notebook, and he's taking musical notation of a phrase that she sung that he wanted to remember. And I was horrified. I was like, well, I can't do that. Like, that's insane. I don't have perfect pitch. And so, right. That was the start of realizing that, like, as a music writer, you're not really an expert, right? There's always going to be someone with more musical knowledge than you. If you're writing about a particular act, a band, a DJ, or whatever, there's going to be readers who have spent decades in that particular world, right? There's someone who devoted their whole life to death metal. And compared to that person, you're always going to be sort of an outsider, kind of a dabbler, even though compared to some readers, you might be pretty well informed. And so that was something I learned early on, is that you're not exactly an expert, right? You can develop some expertise. You can hopefully know what you're talking about, but you're always, as a journalist, something of an outsider, because your job is to translate between the world of people who do this for a living, who are in the studio every day or on stage every day, and the world of readers. So I think journalists and even critics are always somewhere in between. They have some expertise, but I've never considered myself an expert.
No, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, because I think like when it comes to certain, I guess, like, niche platforms and outlets, be it either a Metal Sucks or a Resident Advisor or, historically a Double XL, when it comes to like interviews, when it comes to like feature content, like those platforms are going to dive deeper into their specialty more than any other platform is. Like that's going to be the one place to go for that kind of information. And, I don't know what your opinion is on this take, but personally, I've always found some of those platforms, in my opinion, to flounder a bit when it comes to the criticism side, because when you're so deeply ingrained in and completely reliant upon an audience of people who are like, living and dying by the genre that you're analyzing on a regular basis, like you don't want to shit where you eat, and like create the kind of enemies that you might if, you give like a really negative review that carries with it like a lot of weight. And sometimes when you are sort of like merely criticizing things simply by the metrics of, the limited world that it was born into, like I was kind of saying earlier, you might actually kind of lose sight as to whether or not that record stands tall or is of any substance in the grander scheme of things outside of kind of like the, scene or genre that it was born out of.
Yeah, I don't think that that's specific to sort of like narrow casting publications. I think that's a truth about music media, right? You go back to the 70s and the 80s, and people were shitting on Rolling Stone for giving glowing reviews to solo albums by, John Lennon or Mick Jagger. And the perception was that this was because they were friendly with Jan Wenner. And so I think often what publications find is that in order to build a business model, it can't be just record reviews. And so once you're trying to set up features and interviews, let alone festivals and live events and other kinds of more collaborative things with artists, how does that affect your music criticism? One thing I realized when I went back and I looked at the history, I was like, oh, this has always been a problem for people who write about music.
Now that I think about it more, it's kind of a phenomenon that I think like a lot of people talk about in other contexts with content creators, like with audience capture, because like you say, with Rolling Stone, like though John Lennon and so on and so forth isn't necessarily, specific to a super niche genre, these are still artists that like that magazine built its brand off of, and their audiences pull up, to see specifically what they have to say about those artists.
Well, I mean, everyone's captured by someone, right? Unless you're a literal billionaire who's just doing this for fun. And even then, there's probably some social pressure. But like, someone is paying the bills, right? And it might be your subscribers who expect a certain thing. It might be advertisers. In the old days, if it was a music publication, those advertisers might often be record companies, right? It might be advertisers from outside of the world of music who just want a lot of views, in which case maybe there's a bias towards covering things that a mainstream casual audience will understand and will get clicks, and a bias away from covering more obscure things that don't resonate so much. So, when we talk about capture, part of what we're talking about is the business model, but part of what we're talking about is the audience. Who is this stuff for? What do people like? And the truth is that people do like negative reviews. If you talk to the folks at Pitchfork or other places, like a negative review, I know you've noticed this, we've talked about this, a negative review will pull in an audience. But the fact is, people also like other things. They also like interviews. They also like fashion shoots with an artist, right? They also like reading stories that have a high degree of access. And in some cases, those are things that might pull against the urge to do the negative review. But I think, in fact, like all of those things are a little more old fashioned, right? We're talking about like music publications sustained by record company ads, right? This is a 70s, 80s, 90s phenomenon. This is not so much the issue now. And I think the thing that changed, the thing that made criticism so nice in the 2010s, it was almost like a philosophical shift. It was a shift that happens in the wake of this discussion about rockism and
Mm.
this idea that I wrote about in the 2000s, other folks wrote about, this idea that critics had become kind of set in their ways, a little stuck on a certain vision of what good music sounded and looked like. And they were valuing, the sweaty, earnest guy with the electric guitar singing against the government or something. And so they were having a hard time valuing some of the pop music that was happening, or the country, or the smooth R&B or something. And so people started talking about, the word they used, as you know, is poptimism, right? And this was going to be the antidote to rockism. So I think that was pretty influential. And poptimism consists mainly of the word optimism. And there was this idea that you were going to look on the bright side as a critic and say
Right.
nice things about these pop records, partly because there was like this existential question, right? It's like, well, who the fuck are you to say that this record that all these people love is bad, right? And I think that's a deep question for anyone who is a critic of anything. Like, who are you to say it's terrible? Who are you to rain on someone else's parade? And, I think in the 2010s, the answer to that question was sometimes political, right? It was considered more acceptable to write a bad review if the person was considered to have done something wrong political or stand for something you didn't like politically. But if it was just a pop record, especially if it was a pop record that was considered to stand for something quote unquote good politically, I think there was a lot of pressure to say something nice or to find someone who would say something nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a phenomenon that's going on currently, and I feel like with and this is probably another phenomenon I think we should talk about, but with the way the internet has kind of like blurred the lines between the mainstream and the underground, I feel like we're hearing like a completely like, I don't know, off kilter presentation now of like what's actually underground, what's actually popular, what's edgy
Hmm.
and boundary pushing, and what's not.
Hmm.
For example, like some of the louder and more aggressive and over the top songs on the new Miley Cyrus record. And, I'm
Hmm.
by no means a massive Miley Cyrus fan, are bolder and crazier and louder and again more aggressive on the ears than some underground stuff I hear now. Comparatively speaking, there are edgier tracks on Charlie XCX's Brat, than there was on like the new Royal Otis record, for example. Like you have these bland indie revivalists who are doing the same shit that we heard back in 2010 during the Bloghouse era. Meanwhile, you have not every pop artist, obviously, but you have a lot of pop artists who are doing things, comparatively speaking, that like are more daring.
Yeah, I mean, this is an idea that I'm obsessed with, and I know you are too. I grew up as a punk rocker, and there was a time in my life where like punk and hardcore records, that was all I cared about.
Hmm.
And at a certain point, and this idea of like, there is this kind of maybe naive idea that punk rock is about rebellion and defiance and breaking the rules. And so for me, beyond a certain point, I was like, okay, well, what would break the rules of punk rock? Like, okay, there are these assumptions about what music is supposed to sound like within this little punk rock world. What goes against that? What is offensive to a punk rock sensibility, right? And that kind of like led me out into past hip hop, back out into the mainstream. And so I say that just to say that all these things are always relative. The idea of what's edgy is always relative, the idea of what's breaking the rules. There was a time when drums weren't allowed on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, right? Because it was devoted to country music, which was string music. There was an idea when it might have been considered edgy to have an electric guitar, a loud electric guitar, distorted electric guitar on a country record. More recently, the idea of putting 808s, drums, programmed drums on a country record might have seemed quote unquote edgy. Now that is seen as a sign that your album is really a mainstream country album. Some people would say too mainstream. And so similarly, I think in the music critical world, something like Charlie XCX is way more beloved and prestigious and critically acclaimed than a lot of rock music, especially, a kind of mainstream indie, if that's even the term, band like Royal Otis or something, which gets hardly any critical acclaim, or Teddy Swims or something. So I think the idea of even like which sounds are considered edgy or adventurous, or what we even mean by that. Like when you said edgy, I thought you were going to talk about Kanye, right? Like you want to talk about an edgy like if you're talking about edgy, Heil Hitler by Kanye West is extremely edgy, right? That's
No,
a
it's true.
deeply offensive record, and truly offensive, by which we mean not just that it offends some like lame person out there who doesn't understand what's cool, but like it offends me and you, right? And so the question of what that is, and there's a paradox there, right? Because like the stuff that is kind of critically celebrated is always going to be maybe a little edgy, a little offensive, but not too edgy, not too offensive. Otherwise, those critics wouldn't celebrate it. And part of the discussion about rockism and poptimism, I think, has been a discussion of where music critics' tastes live in comparison to the tastes of the general public, right? If all you're doing is sort of like bestowing your critical praise on whatever happens to sell or whatever happens to stream the most, then you're not that useful, right? Because we can all look up the Spotify numbers and see what's popular and what's not popular. But, as a critic, if your taste goes too far out of step to what people like, then you seem like a weirdo, and your taste isn't very useful to people. So I think certainly I suspect you found as well, that like often music criticism is the most rewarding to people when it exists some sort of productive tension with what's popular, right? So it's not totally out of sync with what's popular, but it's not exactly 100% in sync either. And that tension is part of what we're talking about when we're talking about negative reviews, or when we're talking about poptimism. We're talking about like how and when does the critical community, if that's not a pretentious term, disagree with the general public, and what does that look like?
A couple of things to jump into off of that. I mean, a lot of great points there. Starting with like in context of this conversation that we're having about like what's impacting the quality of music criticism right now. What does it even matter what you feel like or anybody feels like the general public thinks right now? Because it sort of seems like we're also suffering through and maybe it's changing. I guess we'll see, like the death of what we knew as like a monoculture, or the closest thing that we had to a monoculture. I mean, even to the point where you have artists who are as big as Sabrina Carpenter right now, saying openly in interviews, like, I don't care whoever the fuck from, where did she say, like Minnesota thinks about my record. Like the idea that we would, have a pop star at her level sort of like saying openly in an interview, like, generally, I don't care what middle America thinks about my music. Like you're a white blonde pop girly, the idea that like, you wouldn't be thinking about whether or not you're appealing to that demographic or whatever, is sort of, it sort of seems like it's reflective of a new time period where somebody in her position feels safe enough to be able to say, well, I can basically come on here and say, I don't care if this group or that group or this other group of people listen to me, because I know that I have my niche audience who is the most passionate about me, and all I really need to cater to and satisfy is them.
Well, pop music and pop stars have always been inclusive and exclusive at the same time, right? And, even someone like Taylor Swift, who has the biggest, fan army in the world, Swifties sort of feel like they're part of a counterculture, right? They feel like they're part of a group. They feel like the rest of the world doesn't really understand us. And I think you could probably have a similar feeling if you go back to the 80s to like Michael Jackson fans or something, or Madonna fans. There is this idea that like, yes, it's the biggest cult in the world, but it's still a cult and it still feels like it's just us. And so I think that back and forth has always been something really powerful. And, it's really hard to measure like what it would really mean for there to be a monoculture, or what does that mean? Taylor Swift is she markedly less popular than the biggest pop star in the 90s? I don't think so. Like she's sort of everywhere. And the question of what it means to be everywhere has, I think, kind of changed. And so sometimes it feels like both things are happening at once, where, music is sort of like fragmenting and going underground. It's hard for anything to really make an impact. And there's all this stuff. And if I told someone from a different generation about what if I listed the 50 top songs on Spotify or Billboard or something, maybe half the artists, they'd be like, who is that? Maybe more than half. At the same time, when something makes an impact, it really does make an impact. And so, even now, people seem to listen to music all day long. When there's a big show, a lot of people go. This summer I went to see the Bad Bunny show in Puerto Rico, right? He's at an arena that holds nearly 20,000 people, and he did a 30-night residency, partly for locals, but partly for fans who flew to Puerto Rico to see the show. In a way that feels monocultural, but it feels like a different or a new kind of monoculture. And but that said, yes, there's still lots of people there who couldn't name you a Bad Bunny song or don't know the first thing about him. So there is this kind of push-pull, which is, I guess, related to the fact that we have so much access to information, and that this access to information, which I think is a good thing generally. I'm a big fan of information, but it's created all these sort of weird currents and countercurrents that we might not have been able to predict 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that I feel like overwhelmed by on a regular basis, just, speaking of my own personal experience, that and what also just like kind of feels like an increase of the amount of music that there is to just address on a weekly basis now. I mean, when I originally started, I remember feeling like the handful of records that I would typically review every week feeling like a lot. And nowadays I feel like I'm spending more time just sort of figuring out what to do with the 12 to 13 albums now that I personally am interested in, even after sort of like cutting away 2 or 3 times more of that amount off of all the other names that I'm like not necessarily being hit by immediately off the bat when I look at all of those artists and all of those records dropping.
For sure, it's not easy to be the internet's busiest music nerd. It's hard work. But
Sure.
I think, I think that this is also, this is related to the bad review thing too, because sometimes there's a sense that there's so much music out there that if I'm going to grab you and especially in a mainstream publication, I write for the New Yorker. So especially at a publication like that, if I'm going to grab you and say like, hey, check out this thing, it can seem a little perverse to say like, hey, you've never heard of this thing. Check it out. It kind of sucks. And so I think that creates more of a tendency for people to be like, well, if I'm gonna stop and point out this thing, it might as well be a good thing, because otherwise who cares, because there's so much music out there to pay attention to. And I think that is a real change, the amount of music sometimes. And I think sometimes we can forget. I mean, I feel like that is a great thing. I think it's amazing that so many people are making music and distributing music, and that I can hear so much music. I'm old enough to remember the record store era. So the idea that every Friday I can just like walk into the equivalent of Tower Records and listen to everything as much as I want, like, it seems amazing to me still. Like I really love that, because I remember literally taking my lunch money, and my mom would give me, I was growing up in New Haven, my mom would give me $5 to go downtown and get a Subway sandwich. And I'd be like, oh, if I skip lunch, I can buy a cassette at, Cutler's or Rhymes Records or whatever the record store was. And
shout out to Cutler's.
Shout out to Cutler's. That's right. We had a few. We had Strawberries for a minute all the way downtown. And so yes, and that was really exciting to me. So yes, in some ways this is a good problem to have if you love music, that there's so much music out there. But yeah, it's changed the idea of what a critic is. I think it's also important to realize that it used to be hard to hear records, right? It used to be like maybe you get the newspaper every day because that's just what you do. And so you can look in the newspaper and see if the record's any good and then decide if you want to spend $10 for it. And that's kind of flipped, where nowadays often the music is nearly free. You can go to YouTube and listen to whatever you want, even without a subscription. And sometimes publications like mine will ask you to pay to read a review. So it's the opposite. Now it's like you've got to pay to read the review, and the music is basically free. And I think that has also changed the sense of what criticism is, what critics do. I think there's another thing. There's a misconception also, I think, when I talk to people sometimes about clickbait. and the idea that people in my line of work want clicks. Whereas the truth is that often I don't know how many people click on something I write. Certainly the magazine doesn't tell me. I don't get paid based on clicks. And you do, right? Like you see the upside of getting a lot of traffic if you say something. And that might be related to why you are willing to go out on a limb sometimes and put your face on the internet and say, like, this record is terrible, because you get the downside of that, but you also get some of the upside. And I think sometimes people don't realize that for your average writer, especially a freelance writer, you get paid whatever you get paid, regardless of people who read it or not. And if something of yours goes viral as a writer, sometimes there's more downside in that for you than upside.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like, unfortunately, your average person doesn't really know how the editorial section of their favorite, or, you know, the publications that they're most aware of operate, and they sort of attribute a host of things that the writer may have, well, usually has little to no control over, to the writer, like what the headline is going to say, what the score might be on a lot of reviews, like the things that your average reader or, you know, passerby on the internet might see as like, oh, this thing is a thing that's here to make me click on it, or this score here is going to make me react in this way because it's this number, this grade. And again, you know, those things that people are usually reacting the most strongly to is attributed to the writer, even though the writer usually has no say in what that is. Usually the editor or somebody else who's sort of like on the team, who's actually worried about the clicks.
Right.
That's kind of like
Right.
making those decisions, not the person who's actually written the bulk of the text that you're reading.
Yeah, and you know, there is this thing that, you know, you don't have so much because you've like built your own thing, like you're an entrepreneur. But for a lot of people, there is sometimes a certain push-pull versus of the outlet versus the person, right? This is something that Pitchfork kind of decided early on, is that the scores would represent the institution rather than being like, we've got this crazy writer who loves this album. It's like, no, we as an institution think this record is good and that one is bad. And you know, that has always been something that critics sort of have to try to figure out, right? Like in the old days, it was like, oh, Rolling Stone gave 4 stars to this album, not necessarily like, oh, this critic liked this album. And so if there was something bad or embarrassing, right, they gave, what did they give, 3.5 stars to Nevermind by Nirvana or something. If there's a review that people think is too low, that gets kind of like hung around the neck of the publication more than the person. So I think there's that push pull. There's also just the question of like, this is a market. And so the question is, do people love reading record reviews? Do people love reading critical record reviews? And again, this is an old question. This is something that Rolling Stone magazine had to think about. And they maybe realized at a certain point, like, oh, the thing that's selling copies of this magazine is the cover story, is the photography, is access to big names, musicians and other celebrities. And that like maybe the record reviews in the back of the magazine aren't what's really selling the publication, even though they give it some of the credibility. And the truth is, as you know, full disclosure, Pitchfork is part of the Condé Nast family with the New Yorker. But the truth is, I think as they discovered, it's kind of hard to build a business based on just record reviews. You've done it. I don't know a lot of other people that have done it, especially recently.
Well, I feel like, you know, what you say may be true in terms of like those other aspects of those publications being like what really drives certain things like clicks and so on and so forth. But like simultaneously, I can't imagine these brands not taking a hit were they to completely obliterate, you know, like the record review section. Because I mean, I do feel like simultaneously, even if those are not necessarily the biggest traffic driver, generally speaking, like they do bring at least some sort of legitimacy and sort of at least give the perception to the reader that, oh, this isn't just sort of like a cheerleader publication. You know what I mean? Like they're not just here to say every positive thing about everything that happens. Like they're here to, you know, actually analyze and assess and curate on some level, because you have to have some kind of taste to curate. And I feel like, you know, through negative reviews, through positive reviews, you are signaling to your audience, like what is worth their time and what you feel like is not worth their time. And, you know, sure, it is also true that like I've been able to build myself on that, but I feel like in my own way, I also bolster that with other things too, commentaries on other things going on in the music industry, and obviously like my videos and my face and other stuff as well. But it makes me wonder, because I want to know what you think about this, because I feel like we live in this is another example of kind of the paradoxical times that we're existing in, because I'm sure, as you've seen, like there does sort of seem to be, I don't know, this disillusionment or this question. And, pieces like yours that you talked to me for have asked this, along with a bunch of other people recently who are writers who have been kind of curious about this idea that, it's we've kind of like lost the concept of the purpose of what music criticism is, or what it means, or why it still exists, and, why it's still around, if it needs to still be around. But simultaneously, I go on the internet and I see more people being critical of more things than ever in the history of humanity. And yet simultaneously, we're all sitting around like, what's the point of criticism, man? But it's like, we're and sure, while the influx and the saturation and everything else we've been talking about have definitely impacted the business model of it, and what we see as kind of like the traditional display of it, the ivory tower, the old school publication, the article, so on and so forth, all of that has changed, the way that we're kind of used to it. But like, I don't know, when you actually look at the discourse, the quality of it aside, there sort of seems to be more criticism going on than ever.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a very weird job. And like, I remember when I was at the Times in the 2000s, I would tell people like, yeah, this is my job. I go to concerts, I listen to albums, and I say what I think about them. And they're like, that's kind of a weird, like, first they'd be like, how did you get that job? But I think lurking under that was the real question, which is like, why do you get to do that? Like, why should anyone care about what you think about some concert? And the only answer to that question is like, well, I don't know, you tell me. Like, you can read what I write, and then you're the critic now. Like, you tell me if what I write is interesting to you or not, right? There's no way to really make a defense for it except to do it well and hope that people like it. So I think but that question of like, what is this for? What's the point of it? I mean, this is what we do, like, as a species, right? Like, as a species, we make music. So as a species, we like talk about stuff and we argue about stuff. I don't think we'll ever get to a place where we're listening to music as much as we still are, and we're not talking about it. We don't have opinions about it, right? Anything that we love, we have opinions about. And so music criticism, that's just like us sharing our opinions about music. And, to be frank, there are some people that don't find that interesting, although those people probably also have opinions, and they probably also at least sometimes talk to their friends about their opinions, right? So maybe they're consuming music criticism at a kind of like person-to-person level, as opposed to like a broad mass communication level. But yes, that's one of the things that really inspires me, is that even at a moment like the 2010s, and again, I think this might be changing a little bit, but even at a moment when music criticism seemed not very critical, you could go online to Twitter and you could go to YouTube and you would see super strong opinions, right? Even if it's only in the comment section, you would see people going off. And it always warms my heart when music inspires that kind of passion. And I don't mean that in a kind of like warm and fuzzy way, because the only reason I started caring about music as a 14-year-old was that I discovered punk rock and decided that every kind of music that was not punk rock was fucking terrible. Like, that was my conversion moment. And so there is always something really heartwarming to me about the fact that not only that people love music, but also that they hate music, that music pisses people off, that music is divisive, that some people are like, I don't like this kind of music because it reminds me of those kinds of people. I'm not that kind of people. You'd have to be an idiot to like this kind of thing. And so that sense that music helps us define who we are is, to me, part of what is unusually powerful about popular music, even compared to other popular art forms. I think even more than films or than novels, music is something that people really take to heart, and they take these disputes personally. Maybe that's linked to why professional critics got nice, is that like they kind of wanted to step back from those personal or even political disputes. But I think that that doesn't go away because of the way music kind of like gets into our soul, because of the way music is social, right? So it makes us think about other people while we're listening to it. And so we have these strong, maybe outsized reactions where we want to ride or die for anyone who doesn't love BTS as much as we do, or we can't believe these idiots love that pop song. I think it does still stir those passions. And if they don't get kind of channeled into professional music criticism to the extent that that still exists, they get channeled into other outlets.
We talk about music critics, and in your piece you address obviously like this trend toward niceness that we're seeing in like a lot of reviews. But what about like, other examples of phenomenon that we see where it sort of seems like everybody is on the same page, but in the other direction? I mean, in this piece, you kind of address something that I've had, a lot of thoughts on since I had reviewed it, which was the new Katy Perry album, which was a really unique hive mind moment for me, honestly, for a host of different reasons. But I mean, on the surface, the most surprising thing about it is, as far as the pop sphere and general mainstream pop albums are concerned, I feel like that is the most negative. All critics across the board, and even fans alike as well, have just sort of shat on such a large scale piece of media in a very long time. And, in my opinion, while I don't think my review of that and my score for that would have been different in any context, simultaneously, I don't even think that album is that unique in terms of how bland and uninspired it is in the pop sphere. I hear a lot of great pop albums every year these days that I love and that I review very positively, but I don't know if the Katy Perry was so uniquely bad that it deserved maybe more hate, or just significantly more hate than something like, I don't know, I'm trying to think, like the new Tate McRae album, whose music, in my opinion, in a lot of ways, is just as uninspired and just as boring as Woman's World. But Woman's World got a far, far, far more negative, more awful reaction from everybody across the board. And it sort of seemed like, on some level, like, yeah, it partially was inspired by like how terrible the album was and how low that record was in terms of Katie's usual standards. But it also sort of seemed like everybody was kind of looking around with this greater awareness of what the reviews were panning out to be. And I was like, oh, wait, I can hate on this, and like nobody's going to get mad at me. And it sort of seemed like people had like a free reign to do that if they so choose. And a lot of people just chose to go that route.
Is this where I out myself as someone who actually kind of liked? I think I liked 6 of the 11 songs on the Katy Perry album.
and listen, as somebody who came on my channel and was like, you know what, I actually think there are some merits to Lou Reed and Metallica's Lulu. Say your piece, man. Go ahead. If you feel like you have positive things to say about Woman's World, go for it.
But I think those moments are sometimes they feel like critics are sort of behaving the way a fandom does, right? Like part of the fun of being in a fandom is that there is this kind of like bandwagon effect where you sort of like can all rally around and sort of like and be part of the group, right? And so on the one hand, when I saw those negative reviews for Katy Perry, I was like, oh, well, yeah, it's fun to read a negative review, obviously. But there was some part of me that thought like no one disagrees. Like sometimes it seems like there's a little too much critical consensus, right? That like there aren't that many people that say like everyone says this album's trash and I think it's amazing, or vice versa. And again, I think that maybe has to do a little bit, at least with social media, which is good at creating a sort of instant consensus. You'll see this especially with hip hop, where like midnight strikes and the album is released, and like over the course of a few hours, the consensus develops online. Like this one's garbage, this one's trash,
and it's already a classic.
Yes. People are tweeting the memes of like the garbage can on fire, or the earbuds going into the trash. So yes, and it can be fun. Again, it's fun to be part of a group. It's fun to feel like you're part of something. That's the social in social media, and I think that's that's a technological difference between the social media era, which we were living through, and the era that came before that, which was the blog era, where the way you get attention is by saying something weird or unusual or crazy or having a strong voice, right? The social media era is like, no, you're part of this team. And that's the way you kind of get viral, is there is all this synergy between all the different people who hate Katy Perry, and they're all posting memes together. So I think it's maybe a slightly less individualistic era and a slightly more kind of group oriented era. And again, I don't want to act as if one of those things is always bad or always good, right? These are different things that as human beings we love. We love being part of a group. And when the group starts to seem a little too stifling, we love being like, oh, no, I'm not part of a group. I think for myself. And, that push-pull, that inclusion and that exclusion is part of what makes it fun to consume music. And I think, when I wrote about rockism, 21 years ago, I was trying to point out like, the pendulum maybe kind of swung a little far, and there is stuff besides the Strokes and Wilco that's like cool and interesting and fun. And so, yes, the reason I wrote this is like, it felt like for a while anyway, the pendulum kind of swung in this different direction. And it seemed worth it to be like, no, you can disagree. You can hate the thing that everyone else loves. And, there is something fun about that. And there is something not quite believable when there is too much consensus, whether that's good, whether that's a positive or a negative consensus.
I mean, the way that social media kind of plays into this, I feel like is kind of obvious at this point. But what do you feel like, if any, impact, review aggregator sites might have on this? Be those either like fan reviews or like what you might see when you go on Metacritic and, you as a fan or even a critic yourself are able to, within a matter of minutes, like mass consume all of these, quote unquote, professional reviews of a certain thing all at once and, get consensus that way.
It makes it easier to figure out.
Do you feel like that creates pressure to sort of like give in to a certain idea of something as well?
I suspect it's largely the nerds that are going there. And I suspect that most normies are figuring out the vibe consensus in a sort of less programmatic way by just kind of like looking around online and being like, oh, it seems like everyone hates this album, or it seems like, quote unquote, everyone loves this. And the review aggregator sites, I mean, maybe we're coming to an end of an era when that was even that helpful, right? Because so many of the most influential opinions about music might not come from professional critics, right? One meme that goes mega viral might end up being more influential in how an album is viewed than a paid review in some professional outlet. And so
and to speak of a literal example of that, which, I mean, if anybody who's skeptical of that statement, like just look at any negative review of Chance the Rapper's The Big Day. Like, did that have more impact than the fucking I love my wife memes?
Right.
The thing is, like, I went back to that record recently and like, listened to it. And while I didn't like it, and I stand by my review for it, like the fact that he was married didn't come up so often that he was just like beating you over the head with it, killing you to death with it. But it, for whatever reason, it just sort of seemed to be like this one thing that people like got hung up on and insisted like, yeah, it's all he talks about. But it's like, it's really not.
Yeah. And I think one thing, you mentioned the monoculture earlier in terms of like artists. I think sometimes it has felt certainly through the 2010s that there was maybe a bit of a critical monoculture. And whereas maybe in earlier eras, there was more of an idea of that there were critical camps. And here's this record, and these critics really love it, but these ones think it's terrible. These ones kind of think it's meh. And like, that's a different way maybe to think about a record, right? You could think about like, here's a Katy Perry record, 143, is it garbage or not? A different way of thinking about it might be like, well, who's the community of people that really love this record, that really found it, that really embraced it? Is it impossible to imagine people having a sort of like campy nostalgia for this album, in 10 years, going back and thinking that the song Crush is like kind of good? Certainly I remember when Blackout by Britney Spears came out, and it wasn't obvious then how influential or beloved that album would be over the years. And so I guess anytime you see that kind of consensus, I think about, well, what are we missing? What views are not being represented? And yes, the idea that there even is a critical consensus in a lot of times in a lot of media, it hasn't really worked like that. And there have been different camps, different groups. And, as someone who's obsessed with the way we can use music, not just to bring us together, but to kind of divide us, the fact that music can be divisive in that way, maybe that's something that I'm hoping for, is a world where critics are a little more divided or divisive as well.
Yeah, I mean, just a landscape where we have at least some established voices that seemingly have their own differing points of view, so we can get like some actual variety. I mean, even the way that I feel like the reviews are presented on some of these sites that I talked about earlier, even sort of like showing them to people from like the positive to the most negative and having to go through them that way, doesn't necessarily, it kind of like throws things off in terms of sort of like the size and scope and, presence of each of those takes. But with that being said, since your last comment did kind of point forward there. You also mentioned in the piece, like, you are maybe noticing a few trends here and there, kind of like saying maybe there are some examples here of music criticism getting a little bit meaner. You talked about earlier, like, I do sort of see and sense a hunger and a demand among a lot of listeners for negative reviews and negative takes when they come from a genuine place. Like, where do you feel like we're moving forward from here in the next 5 to 10 years when it comes to
the
music
main
reviews?
point of the piece was that you were going to save us all, Anthony, that you were the salvation and you were going to help. No, but
I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die maybe in the next 10 years. So if that happens, somebody else has got to pick it up.
I think one thing that I noticed if I look at the old reviews from the 60s and certainly from the 70s is there is a sense of fun. There is a sense of that, like, yeah, we're out here, we're throwing some elbows, but it's sort of all part of the game. And so I think one thing that happened in the 2010s was the idea people took this stuff really seriously, right? And it would be literally, it would make news headlines if someone said something was bad, and then the artist would clap back, and maybe there's a discourse about mental health or racism or something else. And so I think one thing that would have to happen is that people would have to take these views a little less seriously. I think that's probably true with social media as a whole, right? Like, with the number of takes and views and things that you see on social media, beyond a certain point, maybe people get better at just kind of like shrugging stuff off and saying like, oh, here's this critic who hates K-pop. That's fine. As opposed to like, how dare you? How could you? That said, part of the fun of being a pop music fan is that you take stuff more seriously, is that you get carried away, right? Like the idea, I would never call for pop music fans to be level-headed, right? If everyone were level-headed, I don't think we'd have pop stars in the first place, right? Like, pop stars are built by frenzy and insanity. So yes, there is a push and pull, but I think you're maybe starting to see a moment, maybe as the sort of like millennial age passes to the Zoomer age, where maybe it's a slightly less earnest sensibility that takes hold, a more of a sense of the absurdity of what's happening, the absurdity of music, the absurdity of music criticism. And maybe if you have a better sense of that absurdity, it's easier to have differing opinions without feeling like it's the end of the world.
I'm looking forward to some absurdity. I could use a little bit to take the edge off. I appreciate
you provide us with some absurdity every now and again. I try
to. I do try to. I thank you for taking the time. Again, everybody watching, your site and your book are linked down below, so everybody should go check that out. Along with, we'll link to the piece too. Thank you again, man.
Thank you. This was fun.
There you have it. Thank you guys for watching. What do you think about all of this? Let me know in the comments. I'm sure you will. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up or a link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, the current state of music criticism forever.